The courtyard had become a wound in the earth. Rain fell in savage curtains, turning the sacred ceremonial ground into a churning sea of black mud and shattered ice. The blood moon torches, tall iron pillars that had burned copper red for 3 centuries without flinching, guttered and spat in the storm, as though the sky itself had decided this night was too much to witness. Peasants who had been ordered to lie in the outer walls now crushed themselves against the cold stone, faces pale, mouths open in silent screams they were too terrified to release. Knights in silver-etched plate sat rigid on their war horses along the perimeter. But even those animals, bred specifically for war, trained to stand unmoved through cannon fire and chaos, rolled their eyes white and stomped their hooves in the sucking mud, desperate to run. Nobody ran. Nobody breathed, because the thing in the center of the courtyard had already snapped its enchanted silver chains like they were dried thread. It was enormous. The word wolf did not reach far enough, did not have the right shape or weight to describe what stood in the rain-drenched middle of the blood moon circle, panting steam into the frozen air. It was a mountain given hunger, a darkness that had learned to move. Its fur was black as the space between stars, slicked flat by the rain and caked in mud from where the chains had dragged it, and every breath it pulled through its barreled chest sent a tremor through the ground that the watching crowd felt in their teeth. Its paws, each one wider than a grown man's chest, had already gouged deep furrows into the ceremonial stone, raking through the ancient moon glyphs like they were chalk drawings on a schoolroom floor. Its eyes were burning gold, twin furnaces sunk into a face built for ending things. High Priest Arion had already fled. His ornate ceremonial robes, layers of white and silver thread embroidered with protective moon scripts, lay abandoned in the mud where he had stepped out of them in his haste, as if even the fabric had been too afraid to follow him. The silver censers still swung on their chains from the iron ceremony posts, trailing sacred smoke that the rain immediately murdered. The chalk circle of containment runes, drawn by 6 scribes over 6 days, had been obliterated the moment the beast lunged. The ritual had failed. King Riley's wolf was free, and it had cornered something small in the mud near the sacrificial altar. A low sound rolled out from the beast's chest, not a growl exactly, not the sharp-edged sound of a predator choosing its moment. It was something deeper and more terrible than that. Something ancient and cracking, like the sound a glacier makes when it begins to split from the inside. A sound not of aggression, but of something much more frightening. Pain so vast and old and compressed that it had curdled into rage simply because rage was the only shape it knew how to take. The knights at the perimeter gripped their lances. None of them moved forward. They had their orders: protect the court, protect the nobility, and not one of those orders had anticipated this exact configuration of catastrophe. Their king's own beast, loose, feral, and standing over a maid. She was kneeling in the mud between the beast's front paws. She was small, the kind of small that a kingdom like this one manufactured deliberately, ground people down to over decades of "you are nothing" and "stay in your place" and "do not look above your station." Her dress was the gray-brown of undyed wool, simple and practical, the hem now soaked black with mud and rain. It was a maid's dress, a servant's armor, designed to make her invisible against stone floors and shadowed corridors. Her dark hair, which had been pulled back neatly at the start of the evening when she had been sent to clean the sacrificial altar before the ceremony, had come half loose in the chaos, wet strands plastered against her cheeks and the back of her neck. She had not been supposed to still be here when the ceremony began. She had not been supposed to be here at all. Her hands, ink-stained at the fingertips from a habit she had never quite managed to kill, were raised at her sides, palms turned upward and open. Not in surrender exactly, in something harder than surrender, something that required more courage. She was trembling, but she had not looked away from those burning gold eyes. The beast's massive head swung lower. Another roll of that grinding glacier sound filled the courtyard, and 3 knights' horses broke entirely and bolted for the gate, their riders hauling uselessly at the reins. The remaining court pressed themselves flatter against the walls. A noblewoman fainted into the arms of her attendant. A young squire pressed his forehead against the neck of his trembling destrier and squeezed his eyes shut. And then, the beast moved. Not a lunge, not the explosive forward devastation that everyone watching had braced for, had already begun to mentally catalog as the last thing they would ever see. It moved slowly, deliberately, like something enormous setting down a weight it had been carrying for a very long time. The great black wolf lowered its head, down past its own chest, down past the ceremonial mud, down until its muzzle, wide as a war shield, black-lipped and scarred, came to rest in the cupped palms of the trembling maid, and a long, shuddering exhale poured out of it like steam from a forge suddenly banked. The burning gold eyes dimmed, not to darkness, but to something quieter, something that had no right to exist in that face. Something like relief. For a moment, a single, suspended, impossible moment, the entire blood moon courtyard was silent. Rain fell. Torches guttered. The mud steamed faintly where the beast's breath touched it. The maid's trembling stilled. Her ink-stained fingers rose, slowly, as if she were handling something that might shatter, and she pressed her palm flat against the side of the beast's enormous jaw. From the shadow of the ancient oak tree at the courtyard's far edge, where he had been standing so still he had been invisible, which, for a king, was an extraordinary thing to accomplish, Alpha King Riley watched. His face, as a rule, was an instrument of power. Not handsome exactly, but commanding. Silver hair the color of hoarfrost cut close at the sides, silver eyes that had spent so long looking at people from above that they had forgotten how to look level. He wore a heavy fur-lined cloak, black as his wolf's coat, over leather armor tooled with his lineage's snarling wolf crest, and even standing still in the rain he looked like a force of weather rather than a man. He was not standing still. His hands, pressed flat against the bark of the oak tree, had left gouges in the wood. His silver eyes were not cold now. They were not the glacial instruments of authority that his court feared and his enemies studied. They were wide. Stripped of everything he wore over them, the indifference, the control, the centuries of practiced distance. Rain traced down the sharp planes of his face, and he did not blink it away.
He was watching his wolf, his beast, the raw and untamable fury of his bloodline, the thing that had driven every healer to failure and every ritual to ash, press its massive head deeper into the hands of a girl who cleaned altars for a living. He had never seen it rest, not once, not in all the harrowing years of its possession of him. He did not know her name. He did not know how this was possible. But as he watched her, this small, mud-soaked, ink-fingered girl who should have fled with everyone else and had instead stayed, who was trembling from the center of her bones and touching his beast with the steadiness of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be unmade, Alpha King Riley felt something he had no word for. His wolf made a sound. Not the grinding, continent roar, not the splitting glacier groan of a creature in agony. Something low and broken and very, very young. The entire kingdom had never seen it calm. Not until her. Every story has a soul it's searching for. Every beast has one person it was never supposed to meet. If this story already has its claws in you, if you felt something shift when that wolf lowered its head, then you already understand what this journey is about.
It's not just about kings and maids and ancient curses. It's about being seen when the world has spent your entire life perfecting the art of looking through you. We are building something here, a community of readers who feel things deeply, who root for the ones the world forgot to count. If that's you, you belong in this pack. Subscribe, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that they matter, and turn on your notifications, because when the next chapter drops, you will not want to be the last to know what Trena's touch unlocks in the coldest king this kingdom has ever known. Drop a comment below. Did you feel it the moment the beast went still? Tell us what you think it means. The blood moon is not done with either of them yet. The morning after the blood moon ceremony, nobody spoke about what had happened in the courtyard. This was how the Lichen Kingdom managed the impossible. It simply refused to acknowledge it. Servants moved through the castle corridors with their eyes aimed at the floor, which was where they had been trained to keep them. Knights polished armor that had not needed polishing since yesterday. Nobles gathered in candlelit parlors and talked about the weather, the harvest projections, anything that did not require them to explain why the most feared creature in 3 kingdoms had pressed its face into a maid's hands like a dog seeking comfort. Trena was on her knees scrubbing the great hall floor when the silence started to feel less like discretion and more like the specific weighted quiet of people deliberately not looking at her. She noticed. She always noticed things. That was her problem, according to her mother. The brush moved in tight circles against the stone. Her knuckles reddened from the cold water in the bucket beside her. The hall was vast, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow above the iron chandelier chains. Its walls hung with tapestries depicting generations of alpha kings in various postures of magnificent conquest. She had memorized every tapestry. She had nothing else to do while she worked except look at them. And looking was the one thing nobody had ever thought to take from her. Her ink-stained fingers betrayed her. They always did, the right ones especially. The tips permanently darkened from the hours she spent in the storage cellar beneath the servants' quarters, hunched over her grandfather's journals by the light of a stolen tallow candle. She scrubbed her hands every morning. The stain never fully left. Her mother had stopped commenting on it the way she used to, which meant she had transitioned from commenting to simply using it as evidence in an ongoing, silent verdict she had already reached years ago. Useless. Bookish. Head full of old words that put food in nobody's mouth. Kala's voice lived inside Trena's skull even when Kala herself was 3 corridors away, which she usually was. Always moving, always negotiating, always finding small advantages in the architecture of servitude. Trena's mother had a talent for existing in proximity to power. She positioned herself near enough to useful people to be noticed, far enough from accountability to be safe. It was a skill Trena had never inherited, and Kala had never forgiven her for. Trena had inherited other things instead. She had her grandfather Marin's hands, long-fingered, restless, built for holding quills rather than scrub brushes. She had his eyes, the brown of them so dark they read as black in low light, and his particular way of watching a room, cataloging, sorting, asking questions in the privacy of her own mind that she had learned very early never to speak aloud. She had his books, which were not really books, they were journals, 37 of them, densely packed with his cramped handwriting, bound in water-stained leather and hidden beneath a false bottom in the cedar trunk that lived under her sleeping pallet. She had not been supposed to inherit them. The Alphas had tried to make sure of it. Marin had been a moon scribe once, but Trena did not know that yet. She knew only that his journals were full of things that made the back of her neck prickle, observations about wolfkind written with a precision and intimacy that no simple servant should have possessed, detailed entries about the behavior of wolf spirits in distress, about the difference between rage and anguish in a creature that could not use words, about a rare and theoretical soul type the old texts called a Lupine Anchor. She had read the entry on Lupine Anchors so many times the page had softened at the edges from her fingers. She told herself it was just interesting. She told herself that every time. The scrub brush stilled in her hand. At the far end of the great hall, the temperature dropped. It was not a subtle shift, not the ordinary cold of a drafty castle in late autumn. It was the sudden, decisive cold of a door opened onto winter, except no door had opened. The candle flames in their iron brackets bent sharply sideways, as though leaning away from something. The water in Trena's bucket filmed over with a translucent skim of ice, so thin it was almost imaginary. She pressed her fingertip to it, and it cracked like a whisper. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and King Riley walked through them. He was taller than she had registered from across the courtyard the night before. The fur-lined cloak made him seem wider than a man had any right to be. Black wool so heavy it moved like something alive, the silver wolf clasp at his throat winking in the candlelight as he walked. His silver hair was damp at the edges. His face was the face from the tapestries, except the tapestries had made him merely powerful. In person, up close, he was something more unsettling than that. He was a man held together by will alone, and the will was visibly costing him something. His silver-claw guards filled the doorway behind him, an arrangement of steel and massive shoulders that blocked the light and made the hall feel suddenly smaller. They moved with him, but not near him, maintaining a precise, practiced distance, as if proximity to him at this particular moment carried a risk they had all privately calculated and accepted. Trena pressed herself back against the wall beside her bucket. It was reflex, the instinct of years, the body's own understanding that invisibility was the safest shape she could take. She became very still. She looked at the floor. She did not, however, stop watching from the edge of her vision. Riley crossed the hall slowly. Each step he set down with the deliberate care of a man crossing ice he wasn't certain would hold. The air around him had a quality she could only describe, later, in the journal she kept hidden alongside her grandfather's, as crystallized, as though his presence cooled the moisture in the air itself to something rigid and sharp. Frost crept in faint, lace-thin patterns across the stone floor in his wake, blooming and then retreating as he passed, as if even the cold was uncertain whether to follow him. His silver-claw guards exchanged a look she wasn't supposed to see. She saw it. She had learned to read the language of glances between people who thought no one was watching them. That glance said, "It's getting worse." Riley's gaze swept the hall once, the silver eyes moving with the efficient economy of a man who processed rooms as threat assessments rather than spaces to inhabit. His eyes passed over her, through her, the way eyes always did. He left through the side passage toward the royal wing, and the temperature followed him out like a tide going back. Trena sat on her heels beside her bucket for a long moment after he'd gone. The frost patterns on the floor melted slowly, becoming nothing but a faint dampness that could have been anything. She thought about the journal entry she had read by candlelight 3 nights ago, before the blood moon ceremony had rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. The entry was dated 40 years back, written in her grandfather's careful, slanted hand. In the advanced stages, he had written, the blood-blight manifests as a reversal of the wolf's natural warmth. The infected alpha will begin to cool from the inside out, his own spirit turning against the body's heat as the curse tightens. The court healers will name it rage. They will name it instability. They will name it a dozen things that allow them to avoid naming what it actually is. A man freezing to death inside himself, slowly and with complete awareness of every degree of loss. She picked up her scrub brush. She put it down again. The storage cellar beneath the servants' quarters smelled of tallow and old paper and the particular damp of stone that had been breathing the same air for 300 years. Trena sat cross-legged on the cold floor with 4 of her grandfather's journals open around her, like a circle of small fires, her candle positioned to throw maximum light across the densest pages. She had told her mother she was sleeping. Her mother made a sound that meant, "I don't believe you," and also, "I don't particularly care," and turned back to the conversation she was having at the far end of their shared chamber with one of the laundry women. Trena had waited until the voices dropped into the comfortable murmur of people who have forgotten about you, and then she had taken her candle and her cellar key and gone. Now she read. The entries were not organized in any way that made sense to her before tonight. She had always read them as a collection of observations, the private natural philosophy of an old man who had spent too much time watching wolves. Now, with the image of Riley's frost-painted footprints still fresh and sharp at the front of her mind, she read them differently. She read them the way you read a map when you finally recognize you are the territory it describes. The Lupine Anchor, her grandfather had written in the 31st journal, the one whose spine had been repaired 3 times with different thread, is not identified by any external mark. There is no moon brand, no silver eye, no ancestral tell. The anchor identifies herself through action, specifically through the act of remaining present when every instinct of self-preservation demands retreat. The wolf's submission is the diagnosis. She read the line twice. She read it a 3rd time with her finger pressed to the page. The wolf's submission is the diagnosis. She thought about the burning gold eyes dropping level with her face, the grinding consonant sound shifting into something broken and relieved, the weight of the enormous muzzle settling into her palms with the trust of something that had forgotten trust was a thing that existed. She picked up the pages. She turned the pages with hands that had gone very steady in the way hands sometimes do when the rest of you is falling. The storage section was dense and technical, full of her grandfather's careful botanical diagrams and crossed-out measurements where he had revised his thinking. The anchor's role, he wrote, was not purely passive, not merely to stand near the afflicted king and soothe him by proximity. The connection had to be made through deliberate contact and deliberate presence, a conscious choice to be seen and to see, which activated something in the anchor's blood that his journals called, in the older script he sometimes slipped into, the blood current. But in the early stages, before the blood current was fully awakened, physical anchoring could be augmented, supported. The wolf spirit responded to certain compounds applied at contact points, at the chest specifically, over the heart, where the blood-blight's cold concentrated. He listed the compounds. Trena's eyes moved down the list and stopped at 3 items she knew she could source from the castle's herb stores without authorization, because she was the one who inventoried them each week, and nobody paid attention to inventory discrepancies when they involved a maid. She sat in the cellar for another hour, reading and rereading until she was certain. Then she closed the journals, replaced them beneath their false bottom, and went to find what she needed. The poultice she made was small enough to fit in the clay jar she used for cold cream, which she tucked into the deep pocket of her apron. It smelled of wolfsbane root treated with salt to remove its toxicity, of silver sage ground to powder, of something her grandfather had called grief moss in the journals, but which she knew from the stores as common stone lichen. It was not a cure. She knew better than to call it that. It was the equivalent of pressing your hand against a wound while you figured out how to close it. She went to bed before dawn, and he listed the compounds. Trena's eyes moved down the list and stopped at 3 items she knew she could source from the castle's herb stores without authorization, because she was the one who inventoried them each week, and nobody paid attention to inventory discrepancies when they involved a maid. She sat in the cellar for another hour, reading and rereading until she was certain. Then she closed the journals, replaced them beneath their false bottom, and went to find what she needed. The poultice she made was small enough to fit in the clay jar she used for cold cream, which she tucked into the deep pocket of her apron. It smelled of wolfsbane root treated with salt to remove its toxicity, of silver sage ground to powder, of something her grandfather had called grief moss in the journals, but which she knew from the stores as common stone lichen. It was not a cure. She knew better than to call it that. It was the equivalent of pressing your hand against a wound while you figured out how to close it. She went to bed before dawn and lay awake until the bells rang for morning work, turning the clay jar over and over in her hands in the dark. The summons came that afternoon. Not to her specifically, the order moved through the hierarchy of the servants' quarters in the way orders always did, losing specificity with each transmission. The king required attendance in the royal chambers. The chamberlain required 2 maids from the East Hall detail. The head housekeeper required 2 bodies that could be dispatched immediately and would not ask questions. Trena was standing in exactly the wrong place at the wrong moment, which was a thing that had been happening to her with new and uncomfortable frequency since the blood moon ceremony. The other maid sent was a broad-shouldered woman named Dada, who had been working the castle for 11 years and had the philosophical calm of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. She took one look at Trena's face as they walked the royal corridor and said, quietly, "Don't look at his eyes. Look at his collar or his shoulder, something near but not at." "I've been in the presence of alphas before," Trena said. "Not like him," Dada said, and left it there. The royal chambers were at the castle's highest inhabited level, where the corridors were wider and the stone was dressed more finely, and the tapestries were newer and more expensive and depicted more recent victories. 2 silver-claw guards flanked the door. They did not look at the maids. The door was opened from the inside by the king's steward, a lean man with the expression of someone managing a crisis by refusing to name it as such. "Attend to the hearth and the water basin. Do not speak unless addressed. Do not approach the window. If the king requires anything, signal me." He stepped back. They went in. The chamber was large enough that the hearth at its far end felt distant, and it was cold in a way that no hearth should have failed to prevent. Trena could see the fire burning fine and strong in its grate, stacked well, burning hot, and yet the cold in the room was not the cold of insufficient fire. It was the cold she had felt in the great hall that morning, the cold that laid frost on stone in patterns that retreated from their own edges. Riley was at the window. He stood with his back to the room, one hand braced on the stone frame, looking out over the rain-gray courtyard below. He had removed the fur cloak. In its absence, he was still formidable, wide across the shoulders in the leather armor, the silver hair damp and flattened slightly at the back of his neck. But he was also, for the first time, visibly struggling. The hand on the window frame was pressing too hard. The line of his back was rigid with the concentrated effort of holding a shape. Dada went to the hearth without hesitation, adding wood with efficient, practiced movements. Trena filled the basin from the water jug, took the cloth from its hook, and then stood with the cloth in her hands and the clay jar a small warm weight in her apron pocket, and thought about Marin's journals. The anchor identifies herself through action. Dada was stoking the fire. The steward had stepped out. Trena crossed the room. She had not precisely decided to do it. Her feet made the decision and the rest of her followed, carrying the damp cloth and the certainty that this specific moment was the one where she either remained invisible or became something she did not yet have a word for. She stopped just behind Riley's left shoulder, close enough to be in his periphery, far enough that it could be argued as not intrusion, or at least could be argued as not intrusion. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice came out level. She was surprised. "I've brought a preparation for the cold." The quality of the stillness in the room changed. He didn't turn immediately. The hand on the window frame pressed harder, then consciously released. When he turned slowly, with the controlled deliberation of a man who had learned that sudden movements sometimes had consequences he couldn't predict. His silver eyes found her face. She did not look at his collar or his shoulder. She held the small clay jar out toward him and said, "It should be applied to the chest, over the sternum. I know that's irregular, and I am sorry for the presumption, but I believe it will help with the—" She hesitated over the medical term and chose instead the language of the journals, "the cold that comes from inside." The silence stretched. Then Riley said very quietly, "Who told you?" It was not a question shaped like a question. It was a statement arranged in question form. The difference between someone asking because they don't know and someone asking because they want to understand how you know. "My grandfather's journals," she said. He observed wolfkind. For a long time, he wrote about the blood-blight." Something moved in those silver eyes. Not anger, though anger was what she had braced for, had spent the entire walk of the royal corridor bracing for. Something more complicated than anger. Something older. "Give it to me," he said. She held the jar out. He took it, their fingers not quite touching, and turned it in his hands the way she had turned it the night before in the dark. He opened it, smelled it. His eyes came back to her. "You prepared this yourself?" "Yes, Your Majesty." He studied her for another moment, that silver gaze doing what it had done across the great hall that morning, cataloging and assessing, except this time it was not passing through her, it was landing, fully, the way a hand lands on a door when it actually intends to push. "I'll need your hand to apply it." She understood. The poultice worked at contact points. Her grandfather's entry had been specific. The anchor's touch was the conductor. The compound alone would be half effective at best. She stepped forward. Riley unfastened the top 2 fastenings of his armor with precise, impersonal movements, exposing the leather beneath, then the linen shirt at the collar. He pressed the back of her ink-stained fingers to his chest, just below the throat, over the sternum. The cold hit her like a wall. She had anticipated cold. She had not anticipated this. The vast and specific cold of something alive and suffering. Not the cold of temperature, but the cold of something essential being systematically extinguished. It moved up through her fingertips and into her wrist, and she felt the difference between her warmth and his cold, like a difference in substance, like pressing her hand against the surface of a frozen lake and feeling the weight of the water below. Her other hand, moving without consultation from the rest of her, pressed flat against his chest beside the first. Riley went absolutely still. And then, slowly, with the reluctant quality of something that had forgotten how to do a thing and is relearning it under observation, the grinding cold lessened by 1 fraction of itself, 1 degree, 2. The frost patterns that had been creeping along the floor beneath the window pulled back from her feet. She looked up. Riley was looking down at her with an expression she did not have the language for, because it was not an expression that belonged on the face of a king who had never needed anything from anyone. It was younger than his face and older than his eyes, and she had the disorienting sensation of seeing someone through a window they didn't know was transparent. His silver eyes, which had been flat and controlled and very carefully empty, showed something small and involuntary and entirely unplanned. A flicker of surprise. "You're warm," he said, as if this was information he had encountered unexpectedly, in the way of something he had begun to doubt was real. "Yes, Your Majesty." She did not move her hands. He did not step back. The fire crackled in the grate. The frost retreated from the window pane by another careful inch. Alpha Valerius arrived the following morning with 40 riders, and the particular brand of deliberate pageantry that announced itself as confidence, but was actually threat wearing confidence's clothing. His Dark Moon pack banner, a silver crescent on a field of absolute black, snapped in the wet wind above the gatehouse as his column entered the outer court, the war horses they rode chosen for size and aggression in equal measure. Trena saw the procession from the East Hall window while she was changing the linens on the window seat cushions. She saw the banner. She saw the leader, broad and dark-haired, armored in something spiked at the pauldrons that served no functional purpose but communicated volume of intention very clearly, sitting his massive roan horse with the practiced ease of a man who had made himself comfortable in other people's spaces many times before. She saw, at the base of the outer stair where the servants were arranged in greeting formation, her mother. Kala stood slightly apart from the other servants, which was her habit, near enough to seem to belong, positioned at just the angle that allowed her to be seen by anyone looking from the arriving column toward the castle entrance. Her face was arranged in the pleasantly composed expression Trena knew from long experience was not composure at all, but the careful concealment of active calculation. As Valerius rode past the servant line, his eyes moved across the assembled faces with the practiced efficiency of a predator assessing a new territory. They paused, briefly, at Kala. Kala's chin lifted, barely, in the acknowledgement of someone who had been expecting to be noticed. Trena's hands went still on the linen. She had not seen them speak. She could not have heard anything from this distance. She could not prove anything from this window with this angle in this rain. But she had spent her entire life being dismissed as bookish and impractical, and what that had actually produced was a woman who read rooms the way other people read words, who catalogued small things until they assembled into large and terrible pictures, who had learned from her grandfather's journals that the difference between observation and understanding was whether you were willing to believe what you were seeing. She believed what she was seeing. She folded the linen she was holding with hands that would not quite cooperate and laid it neatly on the window seat. She stood up straight. She looked out at her mother's composed, upturned face one more moment. Then she went back to work. Because she was a maid, and maids went back to work, and she needed time to think about what she was going to do next. She found the note that evening. It was not hidden with any particular care, which was either her mother's arrogance or her mother's certainty that Trena would never think to look, and those two possibilities were so close together they might have been the same thing. The note was folded inside the lining of Kala's second apron, the good one kept folded at the bottom of the cedar chest, and Trena found it because she had been looking, because she had stood at that east hall window and watched her mother's chin lift toward Valerius like a compass needle finding north, and she had spent the rest of the day scrubbing and folding and carrying things, with her mind working quietly beneath the surface of every task, assembling what she knew into a shape she did not want to recognize. The note was short. Her mother had never wasted words on paper, only on people. The king's cold grows worse by the week. The maid who calms him is my daughter. She uses contact, touch at the sternum. If you want the anchor removed, I want passage to the eastern territories and a house, one that doesn't have stone floors. Trena read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in her ink-stained hands and sat on the edge of her mother's sleeping pallet in the dark and quiet of the empty chamber and waited to feel something she could name. What came was not the grief she expected. It was something flatter and colder, something that perhaps had always been waiting at the bottom of every dismissal, every useless, every bookish, every careful positioning of Kala's body just slightly apart from her daughter in rooms where it mattered to be seen separately. This note was not a betrayal that had arrived suddenly. It was the most recent visible surface of something that had been true for a long time, and the only new thing about it was that Trena was holding the proof in her hands and could no longer choose not to see it. She put the note in her apron pocket, next to the empty clay jar. She went to find the king. The silver claw guard outside Riley's study door looked at her the way guards looked at maids, through her mostly, with the specific quality of attention that registered her as furniture rather than person. She said, "I need to speak with the king." And the guard's eyes sharpened slightly, recalibrated, filed her under a different category than the one she'd entered under. "The king is not receiving. Tell him it's the maid from the ceremony," she said. "He'll receive me." There was a pause. The guard looked at her for another moment, then turned and knocked twice in a particular pattern. A brief exchange through the door that Trena could not hear. Then the door opened. Riley was at his desk when she entered. Not working exactly, but positioned near work. The way people position themselves near an activity when they cannot actually concentrate on it. Maps were spread under his forearms. A candle burned at the corner. The frost patterns she had come to recognize as his particular signature traced the legs of the chair and the edges of the stone floor nearest him, delicate and relentless. He looked up. His silver eyes found her immediately, and in the candlelight they were less flat than they had been that first morning in the great hall. 3 days of the poultice and daily contact had done something subtle and real to the cold around him. Not cured, but held, like a hand pressed against the outside of something cracking, slowing the fracture. She crossed the room and placed the note on the map in front of him. She did not speak. She let the note speak first, because she did not yet trust her voice to be as level as she needed it to be. He read it. He read it quickly, with the reading style of someone accustomed to intelligence reports. Once across for the whole of it, then back for specific phrases. His expression did not change in the way expressions change when something is a surprise. It changed in the way they change when a suspicion becomes a confirmed fact, which was a different and quieter shift. He said, "How long have you known?" "Since this afternoon," Trena said. "I found it this evening." "You brought it directly to me?" "Yes." He looked at her then with that same landing fully quality from the chamber, the silver gaze settling on her face and remaining there rather than processing her as part of the background. "Your mother," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I know the scent of a traitor," he said. "I have known it since yesterday morning when Valerius arrived and the air in the outer court changed. I did not know the source." He looked back at the note. "I do now." "What will you do?" She had asked before she decided to ask it, which was becoming a pattern around this man, her mouth moving ahead of her caution in ways she had to stop being surprised by. "What needs to be done?" He folded the note with precise, deliberate movements. "She will leave the castle grounds before the morning bell. She will not enter the kingdom's walls again. That is the mercy." His silver eyes came back to hers. "The mercy exists because of your honesty tonight. Is that understood?" Trena thought about the cedar chest, the note in the apron lining, the stone floors her mother wanted to leave behind. "Understood," she said. She turned to go. "Trena." It was the first time he had used her name. She had not told him her name. He had learned it, which meant he had asked, which meant she occupied enough of his attention that it seemed worth knowing. She stopped. "You could have kept that note," he said, "used it differently, traded it for something." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about her grandfather's journals, about the entry that described the Lupine Anchor not as a power, but as a choice, the continuous, renewable choice to remain present rather than retreat. She thought about the burning gold eyes in the courtyard and what it meant that a creature built from centuries of untreated anguish had recognized something in her before she had recognized it in herself. "Because it wouldn't have been true," she said, "and I'm tired of things not being true." She left him with the folded note and the frost-patterned floor and whatever expression was on his face in the candlelight behind her. She did not look back to see it. Kala was gone before dawn. Trena stood at the servants' yard gate and watched the cart that carried her mother's trunk disappear around the outer wall's curve, and she held the cold knot of feeling in her chest the way she had learned to hold difficult things, not tightly enough to pretend it wasn't there, not loosely enough to let it make her hands shake. The cart rounded the curve. The sound of wheels on stone diminished. The gate stood open a moment longer in the gray morning air. Then Trena shut it and went back to work. 3 days passed in something that was not quite peace, but was the closest thing to it the castle had managed in recent memory. The frost retreated incrementally from Riley's chambers with each session of contact and compound, and while the cold never left entirely, it was too old and too bound into the lineage for 3 days of poultice to undo. There was a quality of managed about it now, a sense of temporary equilibrium. The Silver Claw guards, who had been maintaining their careful distance from their king with the anxious precision of men who had been through several versions of this crisis, began to stand slightly less as though they were calculating exit routes. On the 4th morning, Riley came to find her. Not summoned, found. He appeared at the door of the linen storage where she was cataloging the winter supply inventory, which was a job that required no supervision and thus received none, meaning she was alone with a candle and a list and the pleasant solitude of a task that demanded just enough attention to quiet the louder parts of her mind. She heard the door and turned expecting Dada, or the head housekeeper, and found the king of the Lichen Kingdom standing in the doorway of a storage cupboard, still in his fur cloak, slightly damp from what appeared to have been a walk in the courtyard. She stood up immediately. He held up a hand, not a grand gesture, just the small movement of someone who didn't want a person to change what they were doing on his account, which was such an unusual thing for this particular man to communicate that it took her a moment to parse it correctly. "I'm not here for the compound," he said. "I only wanted—" He stopped, appeared to locate the end of that sentence somewhere and assess whether he wanted to say it. "To be somewhere that doesn't require anything from me for a moment." Trena looked at him. She looked at the crates of folded linen and the single candle and the inventory list in her hand. "It's a storage cupboard," she said. "I know what it is." She moved her candle to the crate beside her and sat back down on the low storage stool. After a moment, Riley crossed the small space and leaned against the opposite wall with his arms folded, and they stayed like that, the king of the Lichen Kingdom and the maid who catalogued his linens, in a silence that had, surprisingly, no sharp edges. In 300 years, no healer, no priest, no council of scribes managed what you did in 3 days with a jar of compound in your hands. He said it without inflection, which somehow made it more rather than less devastating as a statement. I have been looked at for 3 centuries, assessed, analyzed, feared, worshipped, avoided. And I have been, he paused on the word, chose it carefully, alone in every room I have ever stood in, until the courtyard. Trena did not look away. "I see you," she said, simply, without ceremony. Something in his face did the thing it had done in the royal chambers, that involuntary transparency, the expression younger than his face and older than his eyes. He looked at her as though she had said something in a language he had given up believing anyone still spoke. "I know," he said. They sat in the quiet of the linen storage while the candle burned down a quarter of its length, and it was the closest thing to stillness that either of them had known in a very long time. The storm arrived that night without the warning storms usually offered. One moment, the evening was merely gray and cold, the kind of autumn cold that had become familiar and almost comfortable in its consistency. The next, the sky opened with the deliberate, targeting violence of something that had been building pressure for weeks and had finally found its moment. Rain hit the castle walls in horizontal sheets. Thunder cracked so close and so low that the window glass shook in its lead frames, and the candle flames in the corridors bent double, and several went out entirely. And in the chaos of the storm's arrival, the dark moon pack came over the eastern wall. Trena heard the alarm bells before she understood what they meant. 3 long tolls, a pause, 3 more. The pattern that meant the perimeter had been breached rather than merely threatened. She was in the servants' hall when the sound hit, and around her she watched people transition instantly from stillness to controlled panic, the particular panicked fluency of a household that has practiced for exactly this scenario and hoped never to use the practice. She ran toward the sound of it. This was, objectively, the wrong direction. Everyone else was running the other way. Dada grabbed her arm as she passed and said, "Are you completely insane?" And Trena said, "Probably," and kept moving. And Dada let go because she recognized the face of someone who has already made their decision and conserves breath accordingly. The eastern courtyard was chaos made weather. Dark moon-packed soldiers, 30, 40, moving in the disciplined formation of people who had planned this entry with care, poured through the breach in the wall, where the stone had been hit with something heavy and deliberate. Riley's Silverclaw Knights met them in the rain, with the controlled ferocity of men defending something they had sworn to defend, and the courtyard became a collision of bodies and steel, and the particular sounds that battles make, which are nothing like what stories prepare you for. At the center of it all stood Valerius. He was larger than she had registered from the window. On horseback he was imposing. On foot, in the rain, in spiked armor, he was something else entirely, something that wore a human face as a convenience rather than a nature. He was moving toward the main keep door with the focused calm of a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to find there. He was going to find Riley, and Riley was already gone. She could feel it before she saw it. The same way she had felt the temperature drop in the great hall, the same way she had understood the quality of the frost on the floor. The air in the courtyard had changed. Not cold now, something beyond cold, something that had moved past temperature into a category of its own, the air of a space that contained something that was no longer wholly in control of its own nature. Then the sound came, the grinding continent sound, the splitting glacier sound, but wrong, ragged at the edges, broken in its rhythm, the sound of a thing trying to be what it was without the thing that held it together. She had heard his wolf focused, directed, contained in that specific terrible way of a creature that knew what it was doing. This was different. This was a creature that had lost the thread of itself. The massive black form crashed through the side gate of the keep in an explosion of iron and timber, and even Valerius stopped moving. Riley's wolf was bigger than she remembered, or perhaps it was that she had only seen it go still before, and now it was moving, and the difference between those two states was the difference between seeing a river frozen and seeing it flood. It moved without direction, not hunting, not defending, not doing any of the purposeful things a wolf spirit does when it has its human consciousness inside it. It moved the way pain moves when it has been held too long in too small a space, in every direction at once, with the blind, scorching urgency of something that has stopped caring about anything except the pressure stopping. A confused rampage. Her grandfather's journal had described it precisely, and the precision had not prepared her for the reality. Valerius's carefully planned entry dissolved. His soldiers scattered from the wolf's path with the survival instinct that overrides training and ambition alike. Riley's own Silverclaw Knights pulled back to the walls, maintaining defensive positions, but unable to engage their own king's wolf without making things catastrophically worse. Valerius himself backed toward the wall, his confident calm replaced by something more honest. The wolf crashed into the ceremonial fountain at the courtyard's center, and the stone shattered like old bone. It wheeled, napping at something that wasn't there, and its tail swept a rack of weapon stands into splinters. Its burning gold eyes were not focused. They moved constantly, hunting for something to fix on, some anchor in the spinning world of its own making. Trena walked into the courtyard. She walked in from the side gate she'd come through, not running, not creeping, walking, the way she walked when she had made a decision, and the decision was holding her upright. The rain hit her immediately, soaking through her wool dress in the first 3 seconds, plastering her dark hair flat against her face and neck. The mud sucked at her boots. She did not stop. Around her, she heard voices. Dada, somewhere behind her, saying something emphatic and frightened. A Silverclaw Knight shouting a warning from the wall. Valerius, from across the courtyard, going very still with the calculating stillness of someone reassessing a situation rapidly. She did not look at any of them. The wolf's unfocused eyes swung across the courtyard and hit her. They stopped. Not fixing on her yet, not the way they had in the blood moon ceremony, not with that terrible and deliberate lowering of the head, but stopping, the way a compass needle stops when it finds north, even if it doesn't yet know that's what north is. She kept walking. This was the moment her grandfather's journals had described in the 31st volume, in the entry she had read until the page softened. The anchor's power, he had written, is not a weapon and not a gift. It is the willingness to be fully, completely present in the worst possible moment. To choose to be seen when every self-preserving instinct says to become small and invisible. The life current cannot be activated by proximity alone. It requires something the anchor must give deliberately, the release of the thing she has been holding against herself. Trena knew what she had been holding. It lived in the space where her mother's voice lived, the voice that said useless and bookish and arranged itself slightly apart in rooms where it mattered to be seen separately. It lived in the years of making herself invisible as a survival strategy, of shrinking into the walls and the shadows and the particular smallness that the kingdom's hierarchy required of her. It lived in the fact that she had read her grandfather's journals for years and never once thought to apply the word anchor to herself, because some part of her had learned so thoroughly that she was not the kind of person things like that happened to. The cold knot of it sat in her chest like a stone she had been carrying for so long she had stopped noticing the weight. She stopped walking in the center of the courtyard. The wolf was 10 feet from her, massive and rain-soaked and burning with its own unraveling, those gold eyes locked on her face with the desperate, terrible focus of something that has found the one fixed point in a spinning world. She thought about her grandfather, Marin, who had spent his life documenting a truth that other people tried to erase, who had written 37 journals in cramped and careful handwriting and hidden them under a false bottom because the truth required hiding but couldn't require stopping. She thought about ink-stained fingers and stone floors and the particular dignity of remaining curious about the world even when the world repeatedly communicated that she was not worth its curiosity in return. She thought, I am not useless. I am not worthless. I am the thing the journals described, and I have been it my whole life, and the only person who didn't know was me. She let go of the stone. The warmth that came was not the warmth of the poultice, not the warmth of skin against cold skin. It was something that started in her sternum and moved outward through her blood like sunrise moves across a field, slow, total, and entirely without apology for what it illuminates. A golden current moving through her in the way her grandfather's old script had described, the life current rising from wherever it had been waiting inside her with the patience of something that knew the door would open eventually. She raised her hands, palms up. The wolf made the sound. Not the grinding continent sound of its unraveling, the other sound, the one from the courtyard on the night of the blood moon, the broken and relieved sound of a creature that has been holding everything for so long that relief itself has become frightening. It crossed the distance between them in a movement that was not a charge, but a collapse, enormous and shaking, every line of its body communicating not fury, but exhaustion, so vast it had been mistaken for rage for 3 centuries. It went down in the mud at her feet and pressed its great head against her outstretched hands, and the golden, burning eyes closed. Trena pressed both palms flat against the beast's skull. The golden warmth poured out of her and into it, and the thing her grandfather had called the blood-blight, the ancient curse that had frozen generation after generation of this bloodline from the inside out, met the life current and could not hold.
The cold came into her instead. She had expected this from the journals, and she had thought she was prepared for it, and she had been wrong. It entered through her palms and moved up her arms and into her chest like the deepest cold she had ever felt, the cold of something that had been freezing for centuries, the accumulated cold of every moment Riley had spent alone in a room full of people who were afraid of him. It hurt in a way that went past physical, past anything she had a precise word for. Her vision went white at the edges. Her knees hit the mud. She did not move her hands. She thought of the 37th journal, the last entry, written in her grandfather's handwriting that was shakier at the end than at the beginning, but no less precise. The anchor does not hold the cold forever. She holds it only long enough for it to recognize that it no longer has a home in the wolf's spirit. She holds it with love if she has it, with forgiveness if she can reach it. The life current is the warmer thing, and warmth, given enough time and enough willingness, always outlasts cold. Forgiveness. She thought of the stone floors her mother wanted to escape. She thought of every cruelty that had been a bid for survival from someone who never had a grandfather's journals to explain that there was another way to survive. She thought, I release it. I release the scorn. I release the brand of worthless. It was never mine to carry. The cold crested, a wave of it that felt like the end of something. And then it broke. And in the breaking, it became nothing. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the absence of cold. The cleared space where warmth would come.
The frost on the floor of the courtyard hissed. It was a small sound in the aftermath of everything, the storm still throwing rain against the stones, the remaining soldier standing motionless at the walls, Valerius somewhere behind her, not moving, not speaking, but Trena heard it clearly because she was close to the ground, and the ground was changing. The frost patterns that had tracked Riley everywhere he went, that had traced his footsteps on stone floors and crept up the legs of furniture and filmed the water in basins and quietly communicated the state of a man freezing inside himself. Those patterns hissed at the edges, curled and evaporated, like a held breath released. The wolf beneath her hands changed. It was not violent, no shattering transition, no dramatic collapse. It was gradual, the way dawn is gradual, a lightening, a shift in weight and density, the enormous black form becoming something more human in its dimensions, until the hands she held against warm fur were instead resting against the shoulders of a man sitting in the mud with his head bowed, silver hair soaked flat against his neck, leather armor drenched and the fur cloak entirely gone. Riley raised his head. The silver eyes, when they found her face, were not the flat instruments of authority she had first seen across the great hall. They were not the carefully emptied eyes of a man managing a crisis through practiced distance. They were the eyes of someone who had been somewhere very dark and cold for a very long time and had come back. And the coming back was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more honest than triumph, something that didn't need an audience. He looked at his hands. The frost that had perpetually edged his fingers was gone. The skin was the normal temperature of a living person. He looked at her. She was still on her knees in the mud. She realized distantly that she was exhausted in a way that went past the body into something more fundamental, the specific exhaustion of having given something large from the deepest available part of yourself and discovering that the part was still there, still intact, just temporarily emptied and waiting to refill. Behind them, Valerius had not moved. His 40 riders had thinned to perhaps 20, the rest having demonstrated the better part of valor during the wolf's rampage. The Silver Claw Knights were still at their positions, watching. Everyone was watching. Riley stood. He stood the way he moved now, not with the effortful deliberation of a man managing a cracking interior, but with the ordinary straightforwardness of a person standing up. He extended his hand to Trena. She looked at it for a moment. She took it. He pulled her to her feet and then did not release her hand and turned to face the courtyard. "Valerius," he said. His voice carried across the rain-drenched space with a quality it had not had before, not the compelled authority of a man whose power was held together by contained fury, but something deeper and more settled, the voice of a person who no longer needed the threat that had been underlining every word for 300 years. "Valerius, you came to take advantage of a sick king. I am not sick." Valerius looked at Riley's face, then at Trena's, then at the courtyard floor where the frost had been and was not. He made the calculation that a man like Valerius makes when the specific advantage he planned for has ceased to exist. He turned his horse, what was left of his riders falling in behind him, and he rode back through the breach in the eastern wall, into the rain. Nobody stopped him. He would be a problem for another day, the kind that could be addressed through the ordinary channels of power by a king who was finally in possession of himself. Riley watched him go. Then he looked at Trena. She was mud-soaked and rain-drenched, and her dress had not been designed for battlefields, and her dark hair was entirely escaped from its pins and plastered to her face and neck in strips.
She was aware of all of this. She was also aware that she was standing in the courtyard of the Lycan Kingdom holding the hand of the Alpha King, and that approximately 45 people were watching, and that she was not, for once in her life, attempting to become invisible. He said, "Come." The balcony off the royal wing faced east, where the storm was finally beginning to break, the clouds thinning at the horizon into long gray ribbons through which a pale light was beginning to push. The rain had softened to something almost gentle. Below, the courtyard was quiet, servants beginning the careful work of assessing damage, knights at their posts, the ordinary rhythms of a castle reasserting themselves over the extraordinary. Riley stood with his hands on the stone railing, and for the first time there was no frost at his fingers. The stone under his hands was simply stone. The air around him was simply the cold of an autumn morning after rain. Trena stood beside him. She had changed her dress and toweled her hair, and the ink stains on her fingers were, as always, permanent. She had brought nothing, no jar, no compound, no grandfather's journal. She had brought herself, which was the only thing that had ever been required. "What was it?" Riley asked. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the lightening horizon, but it was the kind of not looking that is deeply attentive. "What you did. What you released." "Something I was told was the truth about myself," she said, "that turned out to be someone else's fear wearing the shape of a fact." He was quiet for a moment. "My father bound the blood-blight to the lineage," he said. "I know that now. I have known it for a long time, in the way you know things you can't afford to know. He did it because he was afraid of what mercy would cost him." He paused. "I have spent 3 centuries being the monster he manufactured and telling myself it was simply what I was." "I know," she said, "someone else's fear wearing the shape of a fact." He turned to look at her then, and the silver eyes were clear in the morning light, the flatness entirely gone, and what was underneath was not what she would have predicted from the man she had first seen crossing the great hall with frost in his footsteps. It was not soft. He was not a soft man, and would not become one. But it was present, fully and undefensively present, and presence, she had come to understand, was rarer and more valuable than softness. "Your grandfather, the journals, he was a moon scribe." She looked at him. "You know what that means." "Yes." He turned back to the horizon. "Which means you are not a maid who happened to have the right knowledge at the right moment. You are the last of a line my predecessors tried to eliminate, because you are the only people who can see us clearly enough to help us." He said it plainly, without ceremony. "You were always the scribe queen. You were simply not yet in the room where that mattered."
The light was pushing harder through the cloud ribbons now, catching the wet stone of the courtyard below and the ice in the old fountain and turning all of it briefly golden. Trena thought about her grandfather's 37 journals, about ink-stained fingers and cellar candles and the word worthless that she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it was there. About the moment in the courtyard when she had put it down and discovered that without it she was not smaller, but larger, not emptier, but more entirely herself than she had been since she was a child who had not yet learned to be invisible. She thought about the beast's burning gold eyes going soft in the mud. She thought, I have been seen, and I have seen, and this is how it begins. Below them, in the courtyard, a thin shaft of morning light broke fully through the clouds and struck the ceremonial stone where the blood moon ceremony had unraveled everything and made it new. The frost was gone, every last trace of it, from the railing, from the stone, from the air between two people standing on a balcony at the beginning of something that had no precedent in the kingdom's history, was gone. The warmth that replaced it was ordinary and complete. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left that needed saying before the rest of it could begin. The ruling, the rebuilding, the long and necessary work of a kingdom that had been frozen from its center outwards for 3 centuries and would now slowly have to learn what it meant to thaw. They stood on the balcony in the pale gold light, no longer invisible, no longer cold. The story of the Scribe Queen had not ended. It had only just found its name.